Inside Folsom Prison, world's deadliest inmates and gang secrets exposed. Blood on the yard. Dark prisons hold darker secrets. If you think you're ready to hear them all, make sure you subscribe, drop a like, and tell us your thoughts below, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see Folsom Prison forever. The sound of sirens splits the cold morning air. At Folsom State Prison, nestled against the granite hills of Northern California, the atmosphere is never calm for long. But on this day, it isn't the clang of iron doors or the shouts of guards that stir the air. It's chaos, the kind that leaves a trail of blood across the dusty prison yard. A correctional officer's radio crackles. Code 1, Yard A, weapons involved, multiple down. The clipped voice barely hides the panic. Inmate bodies scatter like ants disturbed from their mound. From the guard tower above, rifles track moving target. Down below, officers in riot gear storm into the fray, shields raised against sharpened shanks glinting in the sun. Folsom's Yard, already notorious as one of the deadliest in California's prison system, has just erupted into yet another war. At the center of it, two men stand locked in a vicious struggle. Both covered in tattoos, both bleeding, both symbols of their respective gangs. One wears the familiar ink of the Mexican Mafia, the Laim. The other bears the lightning bolts and skulls of the Aryan Brotherhood. Their knives rise and fall with mechanical precision, each strike meant not just to wound but to kill. Around them, dozens of men clash in an orgy of violence that seems more like a battlefield than a correctional facility. By the time order is restored, 3 inmates lie dead. 9 more are bleeding on stretchers as medics scramble to load them into waiting ambulances. Blood pools on the concrete, staining it dark red, seeping into the cracks of the prison yard, as if the earth itself is drinking the violence. For the men who live here, this is not an anomaly. This is Folsom. A prison with a bloody legacy. To outsiders, Folsom is most famous for Johnny Cash's legendary 1968 concert. The grainy footage of Cash in black, strumming his guitar before a sea of hardened faces, gave the world a strange romantic view of the prison. But behind the music lies a reality much darker. Built in 1880, Folsom is California's second oldest prison. Its thick stone walls, quarried from the surrounding hills, were meant to be impenetrable. But the real danger has always come from within. For nearly a century and a half, Folsom has been the stage for some of the most violent episodes in American penal history. Riots, stabbings, hostage-takings, Folsom's history reads like a blood-soaked ledger. The prison's design, its overcrowding, and the mixture of lifers with little to lose created an environment where gangs could thrive. By the late 20th century, the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla family all had a stronghold inside. For these groups, Folsom wasn't just a prison. It was a battlefield, a kingdom, and sometimes an execution chamber. The riot nobody forgot. Among the prison's many violent episodes, one stands out as a chilling marker of its brutality. In 1982, the main exercise yard became the scene of one of the deadliest riots in California history. It began with tension simmering between rival gangs, tension that guards knew about but underestimated. On a scorching summer day, the yard was filled with over 100 inmates. When the first knife was pulled, the fight spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the yard erupted into chaos. Inmates wielded homemade weapons, attacking rivals with terrifying efficiency. From the towers, correctional officers opened fire. But even live rounds did little to stop the carnage. By the time the yard was secured, 2 men were dead and dozens more injured. Witnesses later described the scene as resembling a war zone, bodies scattered across the ground, dust mixing with blood, screams echoing off the stone walls. That riot seared itself into the memory of Folsom. It confirmed what many already suspected. Inside these walls, gangs weren't just surviving, they were ruling. And whenever their fragile balance of power tipped, the result was slaughter. The hidden code of violence. For the average inmate at Folsom, survival means understanding the invisible lines that divide the yard. The Mexican Mafia controls certain areas, the Aryan Brotherhood claims others, Black Guerrilla Family and Northern Structure maintain their own turfs. Crossing into the wrong space without permission can be a death sentence. Gang rules are enforced not by negotiation but by blood. If a member is disrespected, retaliation is mandatory. If an order comes down from leadership, disobedience means death. This cycle of violence feeds itself, generation after generation. Correctional officers admit they often feel like spectators more than enforcers. One former guard put it bluntly in a court affidavit: "You don't stop violence at Folsom. You manage it." That management often meant turning a blind eye to smuggled weapons, deals cut in the chow hall, or coded messages passed in the laundry. But every so often, the balance tips. Someone refuses an order. Someone crosses the wrong line. And then the yard runs red again. A murder in the shadows. In the mid-1990s, one killing shocked even hardened officers. An inmate, serving life without parole, was discovered dead in his cell. At first glance, it looked like suicide, a hanging. But the details didn't add up. The knots were tied too expertly, the bruises inconsistent with self-inflicted wounds. Rumors spread quickly. The inmate had been targeted by the Mexican Mafia for failing to carry out an ordered stabbing. His death was staged to look like suicide, but everyone inside knew the truth. The message was clear: disobey and you die, even if you're already serving life. Investigators pushed for answers, but witnesses clammed up. Fear silenced the tear. No one dared speak against the gang. The case was quietly filed away, another unsolved death at Folsom. For the men living inside, it was no mystery at all. It was business as usual. Hostages of the stone fortress. Folsom's violence hasn't always been inmate against inmate. On multiple occasions, correctional staff have found themselves in the crosshairs. One of the most terrifying incidents occurred in 1987, when inmates overpowered two guards in the industry area. Armed with improvised blades, the prisoners dragged the officers into a tool shop and barricaded themselves inside. Their demands were simple: transfers out of Folsom, protection from rival gangs, and media attention to their grievances. For nearly 48 hours, the standoff gripped headlines. Negotiators tried to reason with the inmates, but tensions escalated when one hostage was stabbed in the leg as a warning. The state prepared for a violent rescue. Finally, through a mix of concessions and tactical pressure, the situation ended without fatalities. But for staff, the lesson was clear. At Folsom, even the keepers could become captives. The music versus the madness. The irony is never lost on those who know Folsom's history. Johnny Cash's concert painted the prison as a place where music could reach even the darkest souls. His performance of Folsom Prison Blues became iconic, cementing the prison's name in pop culture forever. But inmates who sat in that audience later described a reality Cash never saw. Behind the applause and the cameras, there was fear. Many of those same men would later die in gang wars, riots, or retaliatory killings. For them, the concert was a rare moment of light in an otherwise brutal existence. Clues of a larger conspiracy. The bloodshed, the staged suicides, the hostage-takings, they all point to a deeper question. Was Folsom just a violent prison, or was it something more sinister? Whispers circulated in law enforcement circles that gangs weren't just operating inside the prison, they were directing criminal enterprises outside. Drug trafficking, extortion, even contract killings were allegedly being ordered from pay phones within Folsom's walls. Wiretaps in the late 1990s seemed to confirm this, catching coded calls between inmates and street associate. But how much did the prison know? How much did they allow? Some former officers, speaking anonymously, claim there were times when administration looked the other way, preferring order under gang control to the chaos of constant warfare. Others dismiss this as speculation, arguing that gangs were simply too powerful to contain. Either way, the result was the same. Folsom wasn't just holding the worst of the worst. It was feeding California's underworld. A knife in the yard. The chapter closes on one more chilling event, one that investigators still reference as proof of Folsom's danger. In 2002, during a seemingly routine yard program, a young inmate walked calmly across the exercise yard. He looked ordinary, unnoticed among the crowd. Suddenly, he pulled a sharpened piece of metal from his waistband and lunged at another prisoner. The attack was fast, brutal, and efficient, 17 stab wounds in less than a minute. The victim was a mid-level shot caller for the Aryan Brotherhood. His killer, investigators later learned, was acting on direct orders from the Mexican Mafia. The murder wasn't spontaneous rage. It was a calculated move in a chess game of prison power. Officers swarmed the yard, rifles raised, inmates forced to the ground. But by then, the victim was already dead. And the killer? He offered no resistance. He dropped the shank, knelt on the ground, and stared straight at the guards with cold, unblinking eyes. The message, once again, was unmistakable. Inside Folsom, the gangs decided who lived and who died. As the body bag was carried off the yard, whispers began to spread through the tiers. Some claimed the murder was just the beginning, that it signaled a larger war brewing inside the prison, one that would spill far beyond its granite walls. For investigators, one detail stood out. The victim had been keeping a notebook. Hidden in his cell, beneath a loose floor tile, was a small spiral pad filled with names, numbers, and coded references to criminal dealings. When detectives flipped through its pages, they realized this wasn't just about a prison stabbing. The notebook hinted at something much bigger, a secret alliance, betrayals among gangs, and connections to crimes committed hundreds of miles away. What was in that notebook would change the course of the investigation and reveal a deadly conspiracy that no one saw coming. The Notebook of Betrayals. The spiral notebook sat on the stainless steel table in the prison's investigative unit, its edges frayed, its cover bent from years of rough handling. To anyone else, it might have looked like the discarded journal of a bored inmate, but the men in suits staring down at it knew better. They had seen scraps of paper topple empires inside California's prisons. The deputy warden tapped a pen against the cover. Names, numbers, codes. This isn't random. This is a map. The contents of that notebook, pulled from beneath the loose floor tile in the Aryan Brotherhood shot caller's cell, read like a roadmap of violence. Some entries were obvious, lists of names with dollar amounts beside them, likely debts. Others were cryptic, initials, dates, and phrases like green light or house cleaning. The investigators, veterans of prison intelligence, recognized the terms immediately. Green light meant someone was marked for death. House cleaning often referred to purges within a gang's own rank. But what made this notebook different was that the names weren't confined to prison walls. There were addresses, phone numbers, cities far beyond Folsom, Bakersfield, Oakland, Los Angeles, notes about truck shipments, mentions of product, collections, and taxes. To the untrained eye, meaningless scribbles. To the investigators, evidence of a shadow empire controlled from inside Folsom. Threads that lead outside. The first breakthrough came with a phone number scrawled in the margin of one page. When detectives ran it, the number traced back to a small auto body shop in East Los Angeles. On paper, it was a legitimate business. But surveillance revealed a steady flow of gang members in and out of its back lot. From wiretaps, agents learned the shop was a hub for laundering drug money. Orders for narcotics shipments were being relayed from prison payphones, disguised as casual calls about car parts. 2 doors, 4 tires, translated to 2 kilos, 4 pounds. The calls were short, the codes simple but effective. And the voice giving the orders? Identified by cadence, confirmed by informants, it belonged to the very inmate whose notebook now lay in custody, the one murdered on Folsom's yard just days earlier. If he was running business on the outside, his killing suddenly seemed less like a random act of gang rivalry and more like a calculated move to silence him. The double game. Inside Folsom, rumors spread faster than fire. Within hours of the stabbing, whispers on the tiers said the Aryan Brotherhood had been betrayed. Some claimed the victim had been skimming from drug profits, taking a cut for himself and falsifying the amounts owed to Laim. Others swore he had been cooperating with investigators, feeding them scraps of information to secure better conditions. Neither story could be confirmed. But one thing was certain: the Mexican Mafia wanted him gone, and someone on the inside had delivered. The notebook, however, complicated everything. If it really was his personal ledger, then maybe he hadn't betrayed anyone. Maybe he was protecting his own gang's secrets. Which begged the question: who tipped off Laim about the ledger's existence? The suspicion alone was enough to send shockwaves through the yard. Men who had eaten side by side, shared contraband, plotted attacks together now eyed each other with paranoia. Every tattoo, every whispered conversation, every handshake carried hidden weight. The investigators close in. Back in Sacramento, the California Department of Corrections Special Services Unit, the SSU, was called in. These were the men trained specifically to investigate gang activity behind bars. They began piecing together the notebook's entries with known criminal cases. To their shock, connections started lining up. A murder in Oakland. A meth lab raid in Riverside. A drive-by shooting in Fresno. Each incident had been filed as a separate case, each under different jurisdictions. But the notebook suggested they weren't random at all. They were coordinated, part of a larger pattern directed from inside Folsom's granite walls. One entry in particular chilled the investigators. Next to a date scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Concert Night, Greenlight." The date matched the evening of a popular band's performance inside the prison just a few months earlier. That night, while music echoed through the chapel, an inmate had been stabbed to death in his cell. At the time, staff believed it was a personal dispute. But the notebook told another story. The killing had been ordered, masked beneath the distraction of the concert. Suddenly, the scope of the gang's reach became terrifyingly clear. They weren't just using the yard for violence. They were orchestrating murders with the precision of a corporate boardroom, hiding orders in plain sight. Betrayal in the ranks. For the investigators, the next step was obvious: find a weak link. Someone who knew about the notebook and feared their own name might be inside. That chance came with an inmate named Jesse Morales, a low-level associate of Laim. Morales had been picked up in the yard sweep after the stabbing. On the surface, he was just another soldier, another tattooed body in a sea of ink. But behind his bravado, detectives sensed hesitation. They pulled him into an interview room, dangling promises of protective custody and possible transfers. At first, Morales scoffed. "You think I'm stupid enough to talk? You know what happens to snitches in here." But when they slid the notebook across the table, his expression shifted. He leaned forward, eyes darting across the pages. Then he froze. His name was there, buried among dozens of others, circled in red ink. Next to it, debt unpaid, action soon. Morales swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. His time was running out. That was the crack investigators needed. Within days, Morales began to talk. He described coded messages, smuggling operations, and meetings in the yard where orders were handed down like commandments. He revealed drop locations outside prison, where street soldiers would retrieve shipments of heroin and meth, hidden inside legitimate cargo. But most importantly, Morales claimed the murdered Aryan Brotherhood leader had been trying to cut a secret deal, not with law enforcement but with another gang. The Secret Alliance. According to Morales, the victim had been negotiating an unprecedented truce between factions of the Aryan Brotherhood and members of the Black Guerrilla family, traditionally bitter enemies. The idea was to carve out a joint control of certain narcotics routes, splitting profits in a way that excluded Laim. If true, it explained everything. The Mexican Mafia, enraged at being cut out, had issued the green light. The stabbing on the yard wasn't just a punishment. It was a message: no deals without Laim's blessing. Investigators were stunned. A secret alliance between white supremacist gangs and black revolutionary groups seemed unthinkable. But in the brutal economy of prison, money often outweighed ideology. And the notebook, filled with cross-referenced names and payments, seemed to support the story. Still, Morales was just one voice. To act on his intel, they needed proof. And that meant going deeper inside than ever before. A dangerous gamble. To crack the case, SSU agents launched what they called Operation Granite. The plan was bold. Insert an undercover officer posing as a corrupt correctional worker willing to smuggle contraband for the gangs. It was a gamble that could expose not only who ordered the stabbing, but also the larger conspiracy hinted at in the notebook. The officer chosen was Daniel Ruiz, a veteran with nerves of steel. He shaved his head, covered his arms with temporary tattoos, and let rumors circulate that he had debts outside prison he needed to pay off. In an environment where money and desperation spoke louder than loyalty, it wasn't long before word reached the right ears. Within weeks, Ruiz was approached in the laundry room by an inmate courier. "Word is, you can move things," the man whispered. Ruiz nodded, saying little, careful not to overplay his role. His first job was small, smuggling in a package of cigarettes. Then came cell phones. Then heroin. Each time, Ruiz passed the contraband along, while investigators outside tracked its movement. Slowly, the picture came into focus. But the deeper Ruiz went, the clearer the danger became. He wasn't just playing courier. He was being tested. One wrong move, one slip of language, and his cover would be blown. Inside Folsom, that didn't mean exposure. It meant death. The deadly twist. Just as the operation seemed to be gaining ground, disaster struck. One morning, an inmate was found stabbed in the shower, another suspected informant. Carved into his chest with a razor blade was a single word: liar. The message wasn't subtle. Someone inside knew there was a leak. And suspicion was spreading like wildfire. Ruiz's handlers debated pulling him out. But he insisted on staying. "If we walk away now, we lose everything," he told them. "We're close. The notebook, the deals, the alliance, it's all connected." Days later, Ruiz was summoned to meet a high-ranking Laim shot-caller. In a dimly lit cell, the man leaned forward, his eyes cold. "We hear you're good at keeping secrets. Prove it." He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "You'll deliver this message outside. Fail, and you die in here." Ruiz nodded, pocketing the note. What he didn't show was the sweat dripping down his spine. When agents opened the note later that night, their blood ran cold. It wasn't just a list of instructions. It was an order, for a hit to be carried out not inside the prison, but on the streets of Sacramento. A name, an address, and the words, "Green light, immediate." The target wasn't a rival gang member. It wasn't a dealer who owed money. It was a state investigator, one of the very men working the Folsom case. The gangs weren't just defending their empire. They were striking back. As the agents stared at the paper, a chilling realization settled in. This wasn't just a prison investigation anymore. The violence inside Folsom was bleeding out into the free world, and unless they moved fast, one of their own would be dead. Blood orders. The fluorescent lights in the Sacramento Command Center buzzed overhead as investigators stared at the folded piece of paper that had been smuggled out of Folsom. The words were scrawled in pencil, but the meaning was deadly clear. A green light had been issued. The target's name was underlined twice. A state investigator who had been at the forefront of the Folsom probe. His address, his car make and model, even the route he drove home each night, all written down in chilling detail. The room was silent, heavy with the weight of realization. This wasn't just another prison yard stabbing. This was an order for murder, carried from the stone walls of Folsom into the quiet neighborhoods of California's capital. The shadow of fear. The investigator in question, Mark Delgado, was a 42-year-old veteran with 2 decades in corrections intelligence. He had broken up riots, flipped gang members, and spent countless hours analyzing coded kites pulled from prison tiers. But never before had his own name been on the paper. When agents told him, he barely flinched. "I knew this was coming," he said grimly, his jaw set. "You poke at snakes long enough, they strike back." Still, precautions were put in place. Delgado's family was moved to a safe house. Surveillance units were stationed near his residence. His car was swapped for an unmarked vehicle. Every step he took was shadowed by armed protection. Yet even with precautions, the danger was real. Laim had proven time and again that their reach extended far beyond prison fences. Murmurs on the street. On the outside, detectives in Los Angeles and Oakland began hearing chatter from confidential informants. Whispers of a big job, whispers that a state man was marked. One gang associate, his face hidden beneath a hoodie, told an undercover cop. Word came straight from Folsom. Green light. No hesitation. Doesn't matter if he's law. Business is business. The FBI was quietly looped in. Joint task forces began sweeping known gang hangouts, hoping to intercept the hit before it happened. But Laim's structure was notoriously decentralized. Orders filtered down in fragments, passed through coded phone calls, smuggled letters, or whispered instructions in visiting rooms. Finding the triggerman before he acted was like chasing shadows. Inside the stone walls. Back inside Folsom, Daniel Ruiz, the undercover officer still posing as a contraband courier, felt the walls closing in. After the assassination note, the stakes of his mission skyrocketed. One night, as he made his rounds, a lifer with cold eyes stopped him in a dim corridor. "You know what happens if you fail them, right?" the inmate said quietly. "They don't just cut your throat. They find your people on the outside. No one escapes." Ruiz forced a nod, hiding the fear rising in his chest. He couldn't show weakness. Not here. But in his mind, he knew, the line between survival and exposure had never been thinner. The notebook, the green light, the growing paranoia, everything pointed to one conclusion. The gangs weren't fractured. They weren't at war. They were collaborating, at least temporarily, to eliminate threats to their empire. And now that empire had chosen its next victim. The pressure mounted. Task force meetings turned frantic. Every day that passed without clarity on the hit team was another day Delgado lived under a death sentence. Agents combed through wiretaps, hoping for a slip. They watched visiting rooms, listening to coded conversations. They intercepted letters that, when held up to light, revealed faint impressions of hidden writing. One intercepted message stood out. Written in Spanish, it referenced the man with the badge who sees too much. It instructed an associate to deliver the gift before the next moon. The gift, investigators believed, was the bullet intended for Delgado. Still, they had no names. No dates. Just shadows. Betrayal in the yard. Inside Folsom, Ruiz's handlers grew desperate. They needed names, fast. And Morales, the low-level Laim associate who had first flipped, was running out of time. One evening, Morales was found bleeding on the tier, a crude blade sunk deep into his side. He survived, but barely. As guards rushed him to medical, his whispered words to Ruiz carried the weight of final confession. It's not just them, it's us. Someone inside the Brotherhood gave them your guy's name. The revelation hit Ruiz like a punch to the gut. The Aryan Brotherhood, supposed to be at war with Laim, had leaked Delgado's identity. It wasn't just an intergang rivalry anymore. It was an alliance sealed by betrayal. Green light in motion. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a routine traffic stop in East Los Angeles. Sheriff's deputies pulled over a battered Honda Civic for a broken taillight. Inside were two young gang associates. In the glove compartment, they found a folded piece of paper with Delgado's name on it, along with a crude map of his neighborhood. Under questioning, one of the men broke. The hit, he admitted, had been ordered by a council of leaders inside Folsom. The payment, $20,000 and protection for their families. It wasn't speculation anymore. The notebook's clues had led to a real, imminent threat. And the conspiracy extended far beyond one gang. It was a coalition, a pact of blood and profit between sworn enemies who had set aside race and ideology for one reason: money. A house of secret. Back inside Folsom, Ruiz continued to walk the razor's edge. Late one night, he was called to deliver contraband to a cell in the old stone wing, a section infamous for housing some of the deadliest inmates. Inside, the walls were covered with crude graffiti. Symbols of the Mexican Mafia, the Brotherhood's runes, the Black Guerrilla family's panther. It wasn't random. It was a declaration. The gangs weren't rivals here. They were partners. The inmate who greeted him, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, placed a package in Ruiz's hands. "Take this out," he ordered. Ruiz nodded, but his heart pounded. Inside the package was more than drugs. Hidden in layers of plastic was another notebook. When Ruiz delivered it to his handlers, their worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't just one man's ledger. It was a coalition's playbook. Names of politicians, businessmen, even correctional staff were written in coded language. Payments, debts, and orders stretched across counties and state. And buried in its pages was a phrase that chilled every reader: Operation Eclipse. Operation Eclipse. The phrase appeared multiple times, always underlined. Next to it, dates and dollar figures. In one entry, the words, "Silence Delgado. Clear the board." No one knew exactly what Operation Eclipse meant. But the implication was terrifying. It wasn't just about Delgado. It was about a larger purge, a coordinated strike that could ripple across California's prison system and onto the street. The urgency of the case escalated overnight. Federal agencies poured resources into surveillance, sweeps, and raids. Informants were pushed harder. Prisoners suspected of involvement were yanked into isolation. But inside Folsom, the gangs only grew more secretive. Messages now traveled on scraps of Bible pages, written in milk so words appeared only under heat. Couriers swallowed tiny capsules of notes, retrieving them later in visiting room bathrooms. The system was porous, and the gangs knew it. A trap set. Agents decided the only way to break the conspiracy was to let it run, but on their terms. Ruiz was instructed to play deeper, to pose as the courier for the next stage of Operation Eclipse. It was a gamble so dangerous that even seasoned investigators questioned it. But without direct evidence, the case would collapse. Ruiz's opportunity came quicker than expected. A high-ranking Brotherhood leader summoned him. The man, his beard streaked with gray, slid a small envelope across the table. "Deliver this. Don't fail." Ruiz nodded, "Bam sweating." He left the cell, hiding the envelope in his boot until he could reach the handlers. Inside was another green light. Another name. This time, it wasn't Delgado. It was someone even higher. A deputy warden of Folsom itself. The notebook had hinted at corruption. The alliances had hinted at betrayal. But now the conspiracy was striking at the very command of the prison. If the deputy warden was killed, it wouldn't just be a tragedy. It would be proof that Folsom's gangs didn't just rule the yard, they ruled the entire prison. The question was no longer whether investigators could stop a hit. It was whether they could dismantle an empire before the empire dismantled them. And time was running out. Empire of Stone. The envelope naming the deputy warden was the moment everything changed. Until now, the gang's power had been terrifying but contained. Killings on the yard, orders whispered down tiers, green lights on rival dealers. But this was different. A hit on a deputy warden meant open war against the system itself. It meant the gangs no longer feared retribution, they were ready to burn the entire institution to the ground. For the task force, the stakes became unbearable. If they pulled Ruiz out now, the undercover operation would collapse, and the gangs would vanish back into the shadows, free to execute Operation Eclipse. But if they left him in, every second he stayed inside Folsom was another second balanced on a knife's edge. The countdown. Agents pieced together the notebook states. The word Eclipse had been marked alongside a single date, underlined 3 times. That date was less than 2 weeks away. The implication was brutal. Within 14 days, a coordinated wave of violence would erupt, inside the prison and on the street. Delgado, the state investigator, remained under guard. But now the deputy warden's name sat atop the greenlight list, with others hinted at in the coded entries. Rival shot callers, suspected snitches, even civilians linked to drug debt. Folsom wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a command center for a shadow army. The Deputy Warden. Deputy Warden Alan Brewster had worked at Folsom for nearly 30 years. A tall man with graying hair, he had walked its tiers longer than some inmates had been alive. But as news of the green light reached him, his stoic expression barely cracked. "They want me dead because I've taken too much from them," Brewster said flatly. "Contraband, power, influence, every time we cut their lines we cost them millions. If I die, it sends a message that no one in this system is untouchable." Despite protective custody measures, Brewster refused to step away. "If I leave now, they win," he told investigators. "And if they can take me, who's next? The warden? The governor? We stop it here, or we don't stop it at all." His words carried weight. But they also painted a target on his back larger than ever. Ruiz's final play. Ruiz knew his mission had reached its breaking point. The gangs trusted him now, enough to hand him orders meant for assassinations. But that trust came with expectations. If he didn't deliver soon, suspicion would fall on him. And suspicion inside Folsom was a death sentence. His handlers devised a desperate plan. They would allow him to continue the courier role, but every package, every note would be intercepted, copied, and replaced with doctored versions. The hope was to delay Operation Eclipse long enough to gather conclusive evidence, to map out the hierarchy of this unholy alliance between the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla family. But the gangs were not fools. They tested Ruiz constantly. One night, a Laim soldier shoved a shank into his hands. "Carry this," he ordered. "If they stop you, use it." Ruiz took the blade, nodding as if unfazed. Inside, his stomach turned. Carrying a weapon inside Folsom didn't just mean survival, it meant complicity. Each day, the line between investigator and criminal blurred. Each day, the mask became harder to remove. The yard explodes. The date circled in the notebook arrived with a sky of iron-gray clouds. From the guard towers, officers scanned the yard nervously. Extra units had been placed on standby. But tension hummed in the air like static before a storm. It began suddenly, without warning. A fight broke out near the pull-up bars. 2 men slammed into each other, blades flashing. Then another clash erupted by the handball courts. Then another. Within seconds, the entire yard ignited into chaos. It wasn't spontaneous violence. It was synchronized. Each gang moved with chilling precision, striking rivals, distracting guards, spreading the battle across the yard like wildfire. Rifle shots cracked from the towers, but inmates fought on, heedless of the bullet. Blood streaked across the pavement, bodies dropped, and screams echoed off the granite walls. This wasn't a riot. This was Eclipse. The inside job. As chaos raged on the yard, Ruiz was summoned to a side corridor. There, a Brotherhood leader shoved a small package into his hand. "For Brewster," he hissed. "End it today." Ruiz's heart pounded. The package was light, wrapped in brown paper. Inside, he knew, was the weapon meant for the deputy warden's execution. In that moment, his cover reached its breaking point. Deliver the package, and Brewster would die. Refuse, and Ruiz himself would be marked for death before the sun set. He made his choice. Slipping into a maintenance closet, Ruiz tore open the package. Inside was a crude but lethal shank, its blade filed to a deadly edge. He stuffed it into his boot, then pulled out a hidden transmitter sewn into his belt. "It's happening," he whispered, barely audible. "They want Brewster dead. Move now." The sting. Within minutes, the prison swarmed with tactical teams. Officers in full riot gear stormed corridors, locking down tiers, dragging inmates to the ground. Helicopters circled overhead as sirens wailed. In the chaos, Ruiz delivered the signal that identified the shot callers. From his vantage point, he pointed discreetly at the men orchestrating the riot with hand gestures, relaying the names later confirmed in the second notebook. By nightfall, over 200 inmates had been hauled into segregation. The yard was littered with shell casings, pools of blood, and the shattered illusion that the gangs ruled unchecked. Brewster was alive. Delgado was alive. Ruiz had survived. Barely. But Eclipse was not without cost. 8 inmates lay dead. Dozens were injured. And the gangs, though hit hard, were far from destroyed. The trials. The months that followed brought some of the most sweeping prosecutions in California prison history. Dozens of inmates were indicted under RICO statutes, charged with conspiracy, murder, and racketeering. Testimony from flipped gang members, including Morales, who survived his stabbing, painted a vivid picture of a prison run like a criminal corporation. In court, prosecutors held up the notebooks as smoking guns. The scribbled codes, the green light orders, the payments, all tied to a web of blood that stretched from Folsom's yard to California's street. Some shot callers received additional life sentences. Others disappeared into federal Supermax facilities, buried in isolation where communication was nearly impossible. For a moment it seemed the empire had cracked. But in whispered corners of Folsom, new names began to rise. New soldiers stepped into the vacuum. The cycle continued. Ruiz's exit. For Daniel Ruiz, the operation ended in silence. His undercover identity was erased, his name removed from official reports. To the inmates who had trusted him, he simply vanished, a ghost swallowed by the system. But the toll on him was immense. For months, he had lived as one of them, carrying their weapons, speaking their codes, walking their tiers. The line between investigator and criminal blurred until it scarred his mind. He knew too well the truth that officials preferred to downplay. Folsom was not a prison controlled by the state. It was a fortress of gangs, where law was written in blood. The legacy of blood. Deputy Warden Brewster continued his work, though with a permanent shadow trailing him. Investigator Delgado returned to duty, but never without checking his mirrors twice. And the legend of Operation Eclipse joined the bloody annals of Folsom's history, another chapter in a story that seemed destined never to end. The stone walls of Folsom had stood since 1880. They had seen hangings, riots, escapes, and music that touched the world. But their true legacy was darker. Behind those walls, empires had risen and fallen, not of governments but of gangs. Empires built on fear, betrayal, and blood. Haunting ending. Years later, a guard walking the tiers found a message scratched faintly into the paint of a cell wall. It read, "Eclipse never ends." The meaning was unclear. A taunt? A prophecy? Or a simple reminder that inside Folsom, violence was not an event but a constant? For those who lived and died there, the truth was undeniable. Folsom wasn't just a prison. It was a kingdom of secrets, where power shifted like shadows, and the only law that mattered was survival. And for those who dared to uncover its darkest truths, one warning remained: if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.